question is, what bearing does this failure of tax reforms have on the decentralization process? Remember that the two main achievements of the government, at least that's what it says, were the NFC award and the 18th Amendment. So the question is, what are the fiscal implications? What impact will the failed tax reform have on the decentralization and the devolution process? Should we be looking again at the revenue assignments, which haven't been touched? What are the medium-term options for the next NFC? And then some concluding remarks. Now, the 18th Amendment is a very historic achievement. I see it as something which has been achieved really as a reaction to long periods in military rule and centralization in this country. And also in many countries, and in looking at improved governance around the world, one sees that overlapping responsibilities lead to diffusion in responsibility. And therefore, to the extent to which governments can be held responsible for the delivery of certain services, that's a good thing. Now the question is whether the entire amount of devolution is going in a sufficiently appropriate direction. So it's a huge challenge. And it's a huge challenge also given the speed of implementation, because we are going to be facing capacity constraints and financial constraints. I think it's important to recognize that this process, as it has happened in many parts of the world, and I worked on devolution from Indonesia to Bolivia and Nigeria, and even in Europe, in Spain and in Germany. Each time you have devolution, there are additional costs for a number of reasons. Whatever the additional costs, I think that it's important to make sure that there is no deterioration in the level of service delivery, particularly at the local level. Because if there is, then we risk a massive reaction and backlash against this whole process. In order to make sure that that doesn't happen, we need to look at the governance institutions, information, where does the money go, is it being used effectively, what are the results of the spending. So all of these questions become extremely relevant in a context where we have had difficulties, or the central government has had difficulties, and provincial governments have had difficulties in justifying what has been spent, where the money has gone. And we are now devolving in a context where it might be into something of a black box. So that's a challenge. And how is the spending going to be financed, especially in this period of crisis? And the deadlock on tax reforms that we just discussed. How is this going to be financed? This to me is a conundrum. But coming back to the 73 Constitution, I think it's a good place to start. It recreated the overlapping spending assignments from the Government of India Act of 1935 and previous constitutions. So it didn't innovate very much in the concurrent lists. And the financing was meant to be through a divisible pool. And what you had were split revenue bases. And these splits, both on the income side, where the sources of income were partly allocated to the center and agriculture to the provinces, and sales taxes to initially were given to the provinces, but then taken up to the center, and then Mr. Bhutto gave back what he thought were haircuts and small services to the provinces in the 73 Constitution. So what you have are maintaining split revenue bases, which again is a legacy of the 1935 Government of India Act. And that's a problem. So what you had was the assignment in 1973 of sales tax on services to the provinces. And in 1973, Mr. Bhutto thought of this as final point sales taxes on services like haircuts, tangible services, much before GST was even in anyone's imagination, certainly not in the subcontinent. Of course, the work that Professor Lord Stern and I did on the GST was in the 80s, and then picked up by the Qamrul Islam Commission and endorsed by them partially, and then implemented at the in 1990. So the GST was not on the horizon when the 1973 Constitution was written. So that poses a bit of a problem. Now, question is, there was a decentralization attempt during the Musharraf years, which is, to some extent also reflective of the basic democracies of Ayub Khan, which basically was seen by the political parties as a measure or mechanism of bypassing the provinces, particularly seen that way by the PML and certainly the PPP. So Musharraf's attempt to do this to basically provide a basis for his pet projects. The overlapping assignments continued. It was not clear what the districts would do. There was no own sources of revenues that were assigned to them. So in a sense, what you had was deconcentration rather than decentralization. Deconcentration is where the districts acted as agents of the center. And it was this deconcentration that I think the 18th Amendment is a reaction to. So essentially, it was a reaction to centralized governance, and deconcentration was a mechanism. So it was a reaction, and it handed most of the responsibilities to the provinces. Now, as one can justify that, and politically that was the case. Even though responsibilities have gone to the provinces, what's going to the local government still is not clear, at least to me. Maybe you would know better, Dr. Gulfaraz. I read Article 140A as leaving the sub-provincial assignments to the provincial assemblies, and it's an open issue. And as I said earlier, the 18th Amendment does not even begin to address the imbalances in the revenue assignments. What it does is reinforces the split bases. It reinforces the fact that GST and services should be given to the provinces, and restates that in no uncertain terms. It belongs to the provinces, should be given to the provinces. And the issue of who administers it, is it administrable? Does it provide an on-source revenue? You've seen that in the discussions that have taken place in the last year, especially when Sindh said they would not allow FPR to administer the GST on services. Well, there was a discussion and there was a solution. We came to a solution, myself and Casa Bengali, which was then basically endorsed by the other provinces. It's workable, but it's not stable. It can be overturned. It can be negated at any point in time. For me, another big problem is the reaffirmed right of provinces to borrow, and without any reference to sustainability criteria. There are no limits in the Constitution. And they can borrow from their own banks, which is very dangerous. Most of the provinces now have their own banks. This is recreating problems that you have seen in Latin America, and the problems you've seen with the Punjab Bank. That's in the newspapers. And it creates a one-way floor on the NFC transfer. So in a sense, what you have is a hamstrung central government, which now cannot finance the promises it's made to the NFC, under the NFC. So that's another problem. Now, a question has been raised in the public. was too much devolved. And there's a discussion now with regards to higher education. But in general, as I said, I think that full accountability is good, except
it's by agreement. European Union doesn't hit them over the head and say this education is now European Union, or healthcare or sanitation rules, or these are not European responsibilities. They're your responsibilities, but these are some standards that we all agree, or you all agree, should apply. So in that sense, you recreate the central role or the coordination role. And you need to, the things that you need to worry about are economies of scale and spillovers, and also congestion costs. So these are factors that lead to a divergence between where the benefits occur and where the costs are perceived. So in a sense, you're looking at externalities. Then there are political economy issues that come into play, and we'll talk a little bit about that. To what extent do you need equalization? You're devolving the functions, but you have equal standards. Balochistan doesn't have the revenue base. How are you going to make sure it can provide a similar level of services to its citizens that Punjab is able to do with a higher revenue base? And for that, then you need a proper equalization system. And the question to ask is, does your divisible pool provide you with an equalization framework? So then you can look at the 4 tiers, which is supranational, national, provincial, and local. And this is, again, with respect to the European Union. So you can think of Islamabad more or less as supranational or national. And you can put the two together. So there are some equalization has to be done at this federation, can't be done. You can have within province equalization, but that's not adequate. So you do need inter-provincial equalization, which is managed by the center. Some policies, financing. So, but at the provincial level and the local level, you do need some clarity. Who does what? And that work hasn't been done, as far as I can see. What is the allocation for primary education? What is the responsibility of the local governments at primary education? Do they have own source revenues? How do they finance this? Does the province need to equalize? So this is an agenda which has not been touched and must be touched if we are to have better service delivery going forward. And then on the decentralization issue, I think from that perspective, this devolution is important. It leads to participatory democracy, so it's a good thing. It leads to better control and accountability by the provinces, which again is a good thing. An effective provision. But the thing that's missing, in order to get accountability, you need own sources at the margin that you can raise and reduce as your needs go up and down. And unfortunately, with the current assignment of the GST on sales, on services, to the provinces, it's not easy to do. Probably impossible to do. So if you were looking at the GST on services, it's not a good own source revenue for the provinces. Own source revenue is where the provinces can raise a rate or reduce it without hurting others and being able to collect it. So that's missing, and that's also missing at the local level. Which is the proper local tax? Because at the moment the property